Clearly, the cost of war is absolutely enormous. And all I'm asking for this year to reach 87 million people with life-saving support is roughly what the world is, 1% of what the world is spending on conflict. We've lost 1,000 colleagues in 3 years because of attacks on humanitarian workers.
That's a huge number.
It's enormous. And so we're saying to governments, invest in humanity. Don't invest all of this technology and ingenuity and money and effort into finding new ways to kill each other. We cannot rely purely on older generations and older leaders. We have to bring into the conversation young people much more energetically because they can see the challenges. And of course, this is, as you point out, one of the great ironies of the climate crisis, that it's the poorest people in the world or the most vulnerable communities that are being hit hardest. Half the world's resource is controlled by the 12 richest men, and they're all men, I'm afraid, on the planet. And too much technological innovation is going into conflict and division.
Hello and welcome to Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm your host, Mahin Azam Khan. Nearly 239 million people are estimated to need humanitarian assistance at the start of 2026. Yet, the Global Humanitarian Response Plan is seeking approximately $23 billion to reach only 87 million people. At the same time, displacement remains at record levels. At the end of 2024, 123.2 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide, while disasters caused 45.8 million new internal displacements during that year alone. Climate disasters are becoming part of the humanitarian system's regular workload. Meanwhile, wars in places such as Gaza, Sudan, and Ukraine are destroying water systems, farmland, forests, and energy infrastructure, leaving environmental damage that may outlast the fighting. To help us better understand these challenges and what they mean for the future of humanitarian action, we are honored to be joined by Mr. Tom Fletcher, United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Hello, Mr. Fletcher. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be at Dawn.
Likewise. So there's no doubt that the humanitarian landscape, has changed dramatically over the past few years. When you look at the humanitarian landscape today, are we still dealing with separate emergencies? Or do you think that the world has entered into a permanent crisis where problems like climate change, economic fragility, and displacement are feeding off into one another?
Well, you're right that none of these problems stop at borders. Climate change certainly doesn't stop at any border. Pandemics, we're currently working to contain the Ebola epidemic in the DRC. That won't stop at borders. Economic inequality doesn't stop at a border. And so you can't take a nationalist approach to all of these challenges. You need the international order. You need ultimately the United Nations functioning effectively and countries looking for global solutions to these global problems.
Absolutely. And I think this also really highlights how interconnected today's, challenges are. And the problem is that when these problems they start intersecting, the approach that we usually take is reactionary, and that pretty much does not work. So if I take climate change specifically, and if I talk about climate change, climate disasters are also now becoming a permanent part of the humanitarian workforce that, the UN does. Flood droughts and heat waves are also becoming increasingly prominent and predictable. But yet, funding only reaches the communities when livelihoods have been lost or crops have been lost. Why do you think that is such? And do you think that we should adopt a reactionary approach or anticipatory approach?
Well, I think that's exactly the right question that we should be confronting policymakers with right now. We're already in a context where our funding has been cut massively for humanitarian work globally. So we've got less finance. And so we have to be more intelligent, more smart about how we use it. And this is a time when the needs are rising because of the number of conflicts. But now, as you say, the needs are being driven up by the climate crisis. And I saw that this week. I've been up in Gilgit-Baltistan and met communities there who are displaced, whose lives have been uprooted after generations living in one place because of the retreat of those glaciers and the floods and the avalanches that are being caused as a result. So we have to be smarter about how we use that funding. And it's clear to us that you can do much more cheaply if you act ahead of a crisis, upstream of a crisis. So I saw the work we're doing to provide early warning systems, to train communities, first aid, for example, so they're ready when a crisis hits, but also to work with communities on relocating them to safer areas when the crises are predictable. And the sad reality right now is that we know there will be more avalanches. There will be more of these dreadful climate disasters that threaten even these toughest of mountain peoples who've lived there for so long, but who are frightened right now of the crises that will hit them in the future.
Absolutely. And I think climate change is one of the most pressing issues that we're facing right now. It's not something that will go away so easily and quickly. And like you mentioned, that of course we need an anticipatory approach. You also mentioned some humanitarian responses, which include early warning systems, cash assistance, and resilience, and local preparedness. So I really want to know that which of these approaches do you think will actually reduce deaths, displacements, and more importantly, also economic losses?
So they all in their way reduce the risk of death. So the early warning systems I saw, for example, the radars that we've got on bridges, so we know when the river reaches a certain height. You know, in the past, people had to rely on a shepherd, maybe calling down to tell them that a flood was on the way. So at least that gives communities some time to prepare. Then you've got the emergency kits that are pre-positioned so that the first responders have got what they need to rescue survivors, give them the medical treatment that they need, for example. And then that work to move communities to safer areas. All of that will save lives. But ultimately, this is all sticking plaster solutions. The real problem is the climate crisis itself. And so we need much stronger, bolder international action to address the challenge of global warming, because for every degree of climate change that we have, and all the indicators are going in the wrong direction, 1 billion people will be forced to move from areas where we've lived for millennia. You can see areas up in Gilgit-Baltistan that are now becoming uninhabitable for those populations. And that's a story that's happening globally. Wildfires, floods, and so on. And so we need stronger political action. Ultimately, we need stronger leadership.
Absolutely. We're talking about this, you just touched upon the fact that, globally, we need more action and we actually need a more coordinated response. So I would sort of like to touch upon what's happening in the global community as well. Extremely unfortunate wars and conflicts are taking place. And estimates also suggest that, Gaza and Ukraine wars have generated substantial, greenhouse gas emissions through military operations and fires and reconstructions. So do you think that countries should be required to measure and disclose their military emissions?
I would love to see that. Clearly, the cost of war is absolutely enormous. And all I'm asking for this year to reach 87 million people with life-saving support is roughly what the world is, 1% of what the world is spending on conflict. So you've got the cost of the war itself, and then the emissions that conflict causes. But then the other thing war does, it drives countries apart. It makes it even harder for the Security Council to function. It makes it even harder for us to get the right kind of international response. It makes peacemaking and diplomacy much harder. It's why, while I've been here, I've been applauding actually the role that I saw the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, the role that they've played, that Pakistan's government has played in the peacemaking around the Straits of Hormuz, in the peacemaking around Gaza, and the resolution 2803, which put in place that ceasefire in Gaza. All of that is actually a huge humanitarian contribution. We need the same energy for the climate negotiations.
Absolutely. And I think that, beyond these emissions, what's happening is that they're actually making these places inhabitable for people to live, just like you mentioned in your previous conversation as well. And I think that a country's water resources and their water management systems are now also actively being targeted in many recent wars. For example, the recent example is that, Ukraine's Kakova Dam destruction, it flooded more than 600 square kilometers. And when we talk about Sudan's war, it has really greatly impacted its agriculture, its waste management system as well. So, do you think that attacks on essential infrastructure are becoming a major driver of hunger and displacement when it comes to climate change and the humanitarian crisis overall?
Certainly becoming more of a problem, and civilian infrastructure should never be attacked. I think you've got two things happening here. One is that conflicts will be increasingly driven by people's need for resource, including water. And I think we're already seeing that across the Middle East, across this region, that people are more conscious of the limitations on the supplies they have, and that risks further conflict. And then you're seeing the deliberate targeting, and this is the second problem, deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. We've seen it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Gaza, where we're now trying to rebuild that infrastructure, particularly around water and waste management. We've seen it across so many of the conflicts that we deal with. Just recently, we were involved in protecting a dam in Syria that was at real risk because of conflict between the parties up in the northeast of Syria. So people are fighting over that civilian infrastructure and often targeting that civilian infrastructure. And that is completely unacceptable under international humanitarian law. And the consequences are devastating.
Absolutely. And I think that I would just like to add to this that Pakistan is also suffering from that because the recent conflict that has been happening between Pakistan and India. India is also sort of, threatening to stop Pakistan's water, which immediately is, an act of war, just like we mentioned. And now I would like to bring the conversation and I would like to bridge it a little bit towards home. So, Pakistan received major international pledges during the 2022 floods, which were devastating for Pakistan. And yet the UN, it continued urging donors to, fulfill these international commitments. But nearly after 4 years, what do you think about Pakistan's recovery and where do you think Pakistan stands? And what exactly would you like to say about the gap that stands between what was promised, approved, and what do you think actually got delivered?
So I was very impressed by the visit I made to the National Disaster Management Authority and the work that they have in place, which is really impressive. I was going around taking careful notes and thinking, we need this at the global level to help us, again, to your earlier point, prepare for the more predictable climate crises. Now, no donor response, no crisis response to any emergency will ever be perfect. And in both 2022 and 2025, of course, I wish we'd been able to raise more funding, that there'd been more generosity. We're facing at the moment, and 2025 was a big example of this, a retreat from international solidarity, a retreat from financing and support and engagement around these big humanitarian crises. It's why we're trying to do more of this anticipatory action to use the resource that we have more intelligently. But globally, right now, we are in a retreat from those sorts of interventions, and countries are turning inwards. They're becoming less generous, less willing to fund these appeals.
You just mentioned that, countries are becoming less generous. So while, of course, like reconstruction and rebuilding is a long process and no country should, ever do it alone, it has to rely on its domestic resources and international support as well. But while we're on that, countries are, leaning inwards. So wars in Sudan, Gaza, and Ukraine are, absorbing significant donor attention and resources as well. Do you think that climate vulnerable countries like Pakistan are being crowded out of humanitarian funding because of this?
I think there is a real risk of that because, of course, those wars are very much in the media, and it's natural that in the planning and in the response, people tend to respond to the thing they can see right there. And I mean, that's why I wanted to go to Gilgit-Baltistan, because I wanted to communicate the reality of that climate challenge, the humanitarian impact that has on those communities, on their lives, on their livelihoods, and to get across to the public globally that this isn't something happening on the other side of the world. This is something that's coming in everyone's direction. We can see it with the wildfires in Europe and Australia and America over the summer right now. And that we need that collective attention, that collective grip, because otherwise, you're right, climate change always ends up being the thing that doesn't quite get the attention and the funding that's needed until it's too late. And it was really striking for me today, flying over those mountains, flying back to Islamabad, and thinking, this is landscape that hasn't changed in millennia. Those tiny millimeter by millimeter changes over time in that landscape, mountains that were here long before we were here, as humans, and we'll be here long after we've gone. And yet, in one generation, my lifetime, just over 50 years, we have changed that landscape so significantly. And, when you're in the mountains, you feel awe and wonder and exhilaration at the beauty of it, but you also feel that danger. And for me, it was a real wake-up call, and it will drive my engagement on climate change in the coming period and press me to make it more of a priority for humanitarian action.
You're right. You can't, outsmart nature. Nature is, magnificent, and humans have tried to, outsmart it in one way or the other. And it is very clear from our conversation today as well that the humanitarian response today is no longer about the reactionary approach. It is more about the anticipatory approach. It's more about helping those that are in the front lines, and it is more about helping those communities, just like you mentioned in Gilgit-Baltistan as well as your recent visit. So my next question to you would be that what are some of the short-term and long-term responses that you think that the UN can do so that long-term climate recovery does not become a forgotten crisis?
So some of this is about that humanitarian emergency response, but a large component has to be about development. It has to be about building economic resilience in those communities, in those societies. And to do that, you need to work with the local authorities, the national authorities. This is the work that the World Bank do so well, that the UN Development Programme do so well. We're here as the emergency, the crisis response. Think of us as like the first responders, like the fire agency or the ambulance service that goes in to support the survivors. But ultimately, we need those big challenges to be addressed by local authorities, by the development actors, and working with the communities themselves. I find everywhere we go, communities have a very strong idea of what they need. They know whether it's sustainable for them to stay or whether they need help to leave. They were very clear on that with me over the last 2 days. So I think we should always listen carefully to those community voices. It's why our humanitarian fund in Pakistan now, 95% of that finance goes to local organizations rather than international organizations. We want to put them at the center of our response.
Absolutely. And I think local capacity building is also the way to go because at a certain point, Pakistan and other countries who are climate vulnerable, they need to be more reliant within themselves rather than, being reliant on external funding. Like you said, that, there's only much that the donor organization and humanitarian, organizations can do.
And I found, by the way, that those communities, they're proud mountain people. They want to be self-reliant.
Yes,
They don't want to be reliant on the capital or the international community. They've lived for generations and sustained their lives themselves, but they're being presented with a challenge here that they didn't create.
Absolutely.
Climate change wasn't created by those communities, and we have to recognize and show that solidarity.
Absolutely. I think those who contribute the least in the end are the ones who actually get impacted the most. Unfortunately, this is what climate change is all about. And I think what we just discussed is that the need for action is evident, but equally important is ensuring that these efforts are sustained well beyond the immediate emergency. I would also like to, discuss another intersection that is within these crises, which is that, conflict produces displacement. And then climate change also, surges this displacement. So, how should the humanitarian response differ between the two?
It's very difficult. I mean, we have to go first where the needs are greatest. So we have a way of measuring that. And we talk about severity 4 and 5, the greatest needs. And sometimes that will be displaced communities. Sometimes it will be within the communities left behind. Sometimes it's where the conflict is greatest. Sometimes it's where the climate crisis is hitting. So we crunch all of that data and then work out how to prioritize most effectively. And it's a tough job to do because of the lack of resource, but it's why we've identified these 87 million people that we need to reach this year with life-saving support globally. And by the way, the good news is we've reached 25 million already this year. I mean, that's extraordinary in the context that we're working in with, that lack of international attention, lack of international funding. My colleagues are out there right now saving those lives.
Amazing. The statistics that you just shared with us, that just shows how far humanitarian response is going by the UN. Would you like to tell us a little about which countries do you think are most at risk when it comes to climate change and displacement?
Well, it's a big challenge throughout the countries we work in. So if you look across the Middle East right now,
Yeah.
you can see those conflicts increasingly driven by water, and there is a huge displacement of people between Lebanon and Syria in particular. I've visited both in the last few months and seen that movement of people across Africa. I was recently in Somalia, South Sudan. I spent a week in Darfur. You are seeing the way in which the climate crisis is now overlapping with humanitarian needs. So take somewhere like Chad, which is in the top 5 most vulnerable countries for climate change. It's also in the top 5 for existing inequality. And now you've got layers of conflict as well. So it's where you started the conversation, actually. You're getting the overlap between these different crises. And it's our job then to join the dots and make sure we're delivering the right response in the right place, whether it's food, water, medicine, shelter for those communities on the move as well. But this displacement point is important. And there will be much, much more displacement in the coming period because of climate than we've had in recent years. And if you take the migration rates in recent years, they've already had a huge impact on politics and society in the countries receiving people on the move. But the reality of human history is that our ancestors were migrants, and climate will mean our descendants are migrants as well. And so we've got to start treating visitors to our countries with the same generosity and dignity and respect that we would expect if we were displaced. We have to imagine ourselves being displaced because we will be.
Absolutely. And I think this is an intersection that, of course, the communities that are being affected by it did not hope that would happen. And it's something that they did not have a part to play in. And like you just mentioned, also that slowly the lines are actually being blurred as well when it comes to the displacement that is caused generally by conflicts and wars, and that is caused by climate change as well. Countries such as Sudan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and Democratic Republic of Congo, they face both conflict and climate exposure as well. How do agencies, plan for people who may be displaced by war, drought, and floods within the same period? What exactly is the strategy to help out those people?
It's very difficult. And so we're trying to use more foresight now to try and predict where the climate crises will hit. And the sad reality is that it is predictable where the areas that will be hit hardest. I've just come from Venezuela, which was just hit by an earthquake. So we can look at the countries, for example, on the fault lines of earthquakes, or those where glacier melt, as I've seen over the last 2 days, will have the biggest impact, those where forest fires are hitting. And then we have our existing map then of existing conflicts. And what we're trying to do is to track then migration routes, displacement routes, and to make sure that we have a consolidated strategy. And so we call this the Global Humanitarian Overview. And at the end of every year, we map where we think the humanitarian needs are globally and look at where those needs are most severe. And that then drives all of our planning and drives our country plans for all of those frontline crises. So we can then appeal to donors to put the resource in the right place. And that's really the work of my department, of OCHA. We coordinate the resource coming in and make sure it reaches those who need it most.
And I think that is the right way to go about it because data is what tells us, and data is something that should be the center of all policies. Unfortunately, in many countries that are bearing the brunt of climate change, data is a major problem, which is why the strategies that are also being applied over there are not sufficient enough because countries like Pakistan, including, we don't have enough data. So
Yeah,
that is
it's a
indeed
big
right.
challenge. You're right. I was impressed by the Aga Khan Foundation's work. I was with them for the last 2 days in actually processing a lot of data and doing a lot of forecasting alongside those communities that they are serving up in Gilgit-Baltistan. And we need more of that at the global level. We need to make sure that technology works for us and we're not working for technology. Right now, half the world's resource is controlled by the 12 richest men, and they're all men, I'm afraid, on the planet. And too much technological innovation is going into conflict and division. Look at the amount of money being spent on drones right now.
Absolutely.
And one of the big trends over the last year has been that huge increase in drone attacks on civilians, whether it's in Ukraine or Sudan or Gaza. And those drone attacks on humanitarian workers as well. We've lost 1,000 colleagues in 3 years because of attacks on humanitarian workers.
That's a huge number.
It's enormous. And so we're saying to governments, invest in humanity. Don't invest all of this technology and ingenuity and money and effort into finding new ways to kill each other.
Absolutely. And I think that there has to be hope and there has to be a positive way around this. And this is not what we want our future to look like. We want to use technology in a better manner and in a more positive manner. I would like to bring the conversation back to Pakistan. You have mentioned your recent trip to Gilgit-Baltistan and, spoken about the frontline communities. What do you think Pakistan should really prioritize before the next floods and the heat waves?
So I'd say the first thing to do is to talk to those communities and really understand their sense of the needs. They understand the land, they understand the landscape, they understand the ecosystem they're living in. Then I think getting the right data in place, and I saw that happening at the National Disaster Management Agency, to make sure technology is supporting the response. And then prioritizing anticipatory action, to really thinking about those upstream interventions, the early warnings, the training, relocations where necessary. I think then you have a consolidated strategy. And then appealing then to the international community to support where necessary, but driving it as much as possible from that local level.
Yeah, and I think Pakistan really needs to focus on adaptation and it really needs to adapt before the disaster takes place. I think more of our focus is usually on mitigation strategies, but year after year, we have been proved that, this is not something that's going to stop and we need to adapt before the next disaster strikes. And I think Pakistan has also become one of the most clear examples of how climate change can quickly, really evolve into a humanitarian crisis, which it has for us, in the past few years.
And look, this is a moment when you hear lots of leaders denying the impact of climate change, denying climate change itself, challenging the science. I was up there those last 2 days. I saw it with my own eyes. No one in those communities is challenging this reality.
So, looking ahead, how do you think the international community can better support communities that are on the front lines of climate change but have limited resources to, respond? For example, just like Gilgit-Baltistan or many other communities in different countries that are facing the brunt of climate change in Bangladesh, India, etc.
And of course, this is, as you point out, one of the great ironies of the climate crisis, that it's the poorest people in the world or the most vulnerable communities that are being hit hardest by the worst of the climate crisis. And so the most important thing is we need countries to stick to the agreements they've made. The Paris Agreement, the various COP agreements over the years, those negotiations have been incredibly difficult and complex. And the danger is that in a world that's pulling apart, people then prioritize other things. They pull away from the agreements they made. And ultimately that damages all of us. I'd also say that in all of this, we cannot rely purely on older generations and older leaders. We have to bring into the conversation young people much more energetically, because they can see the challenges. They will be living in this dangerous world that we are creating. And we've got to ensure that they feel empowered to be part of the solution.
Collaboration, like you mentioned, is the key, right? Like we have to involve all the stakeholders in the society and all international stakeholders as well. And with what the world is moving towards right now, it may seem messy, but hope is all we have. And we need to come towards a certain conclusion because climate change, like you mentioned, is not going anywhere.
Absolutely. So you can't just deal with this in the old way.
Exactly.
So traditionally, in diplomacy, when we had a problem that we were dealing with, we would gather the foreign ministers at a big conference. We've been doing this for hundreds of years and try and get some sort of treaty or agreement between those different governments. That's not good enough on climate change. This is a threat to everyone. And so you've got to have in the room business, you've got to have civil society, you've got to have young people, you've got to have the technology experts. And you've got to find ways to solve these problems together. It won't be good enough to have just a government agreement, just a treaty or an accord in the classic way. We need a whole of society approach. This is a man-made solution, and we need humans to come together and find the answers.
I'm going to also expand on the fact that you said that, young people are extremely important when it comes to climate change. And as you rightfully said, that they need to be present in the room when we talk about these issues, because it is the youngsters and the future generations that will bear the brunt of climate change and are beginning to actually feel more brunt when it comes to climate change. And just to, wrap up the conversation, I'd like to ask you one last question, Mr. Fletcher, which is that in the next 5 to 10 years, what gives you hope that the world can become better prepared for the humanitarian impacts of climate change?
So I always try and find hope wherever we go. And one of the great privileges of my job is that I get to meet so many communities who are at the most vulnerable end at the moment, who are suffering most. And always their dignity and resilience and courage is extraordinary. So I take hope from the last 2 days from those community leaders that I met in Gilgit-Baltistan, the way that they're adapting and thinking, the way that they understand their leadership role in their own communities as being central to the survival of those communities in the face of such a grave threat. So I take hope from that. I take hope from, in a moment when the world seems to be pulling apart, that there are countries stepping up and saying, no, we need international diplomacy. We need the United Nations to work well. I take hope from human ingenuity. Over time, we've faced so many threats as humanity, and we've had some pretty dark moments and dark decades and dark centuries, but we've normally found a way to marshal our curiosity and our creativity and our empathy for each other, to marshal the power of human solidarity to come to a better solution. And so we need people to stop thinking in such a short-term, selfish way and start to think like good ancestors. We've got to be thinking, what's the right approach now that will support future generations? And if we think in that, with that mindset, then we'll be fine.
Absolutely. And I'm going to take hope from your message that, we as humans, we have empathy and we can adapt and we have the capacity to do better. Thank you so much for this brilliant conversation, and it was a pleasure having you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
As we've heard, the humanitarian challenges facing the world today are becoming increasingly complex, with conflict, climate change, and displacement, placing unprecedented pressures on communities and the global response system. Today's discussion has also highlighted that there are practical solutions, from investing in preparedness and early action to strengthening international cooperation and supporting the communities most at risk. Ultimately, building a climate resilient future will require long-term commitment, sustained investment, and the collective efforts of governments, institutions, and people around the world. These are conversations that affect all of us, because humanitarian crisis and climate change knows no borders. Thank you for watching Front Seat to Climate Change. We'll see you next time with another conversation exploring the people, policies, and ideas shaping a more sustainable and resilient future.